Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much. It's great to hear that bird song. So I hope you feel content and comfortable, if a little hot. And I'm looking forward to participating in the conference today. And most of the presentations are about practical initiatives that try to frame openness in a way that is inclusive and equitable as possible. I'm looking forward to discussing some of those with you. But what I'd like to do in this introductory presentation is to think about that framing, to think about some of the conceptual ideas that underpin open access and indeed other forms of openness. So I'll be dealing with some of the theory here, but the theory has profound practical implications. And I'm focusing on open access and on achieving a form of open access which is both effective and equitable. And both of these are important. By an effective system, I mean a system that is one set up to successfully achieve the functions of scholarly communication in a way that is sustainable, thinking about that word sustainability in as broad a way as possible. And by an equitable system, I mean a system that enables contributions from as wide a range of people as possible in a way that does not disadvantage individuals and groups. And both of these, I would argue, are important. Now, I'm focusing on open access in particular, but many of my remarks will apply just as much to open science or open research more generally. And I kept my slides quite full so you can use them as reference points for what I'm saying. Now, we're talking in a context where historically, at least, open access has often been regarded as a self-evident good. And a self-evident good which results in global benefits. And crucially, those benefits are evident, many of its advocates would say, in both low and middle income countries, LMICs, as well as in high income countries, and even within high income countries, within both high and low resource contexts. And those benefits are often articulated in terms of academic benefits, like accelerating scholarly communication or extending the reach of publications, but also societal benefits, like, for example, informing clinical practice, informing policy or economic development, and so on. And so since the beginning of the 21st century, we've seen a growth of open access, which has been supported by governments worldwide, as well as by others. And we've seen that growth particularly in areas of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and I'm also including medicine in that to make it pretty much a parallel with the STM label used by publishers. And yet, over the last 10 years in particular, we've seen growing criticism of open access. Now, this criticism takes lots of different forms, but I've grouped them into three basic categories. So first of all, open access has been critiqued as imposing inappropriate and unsustainable business and publishing models on low resource context. And coming in for particular criticism here has been the APC business model, article processing charges, where people effectively pay to publish. And that is seen as exclusionary. So that's the first criticism. The second is that open access has been criticized as perpetuating or even exacerbating pre-existing inequities in the scholarly communication system, in research evaluation and assessment systems, as well as in academia more generally. And coming under particular criticism here has been things like university rankings and league tables, which are by definition inequitable, since they measure things like publication rates in high impact factor journals and so on, and result in inequitable outcomes. So that's the second criticism. The third is that open access has been critiqued as imposing on the global south an alien and oppressive forms of knowledge associated with the global north, which has marginalized indigenous knowledge forms and thus created epistemic injustice. And you can see in this quotation, which I won't read on the right-hand side of the screen, all of these kinds of critiques being leveled at open access, particularly the third kind. Now, this third category is important because it illustrates to us very clearly that the debate about open access is not just about business models or research evaluation systems, important though those things are. It's also about what constitutes valid and valuable knowledge, on how we know and who gets to say. And so this is really foundational in terms of what librarians actually do in terms of the knowledge and the knowledge objects that we manage. So it's important we think through these things. And you can see how challenging these critiques are for advocates of open access, of which I would number myself, by the way. And particularly challenging because in the case of the first two, you could say, however difficult this might be, well, we can change the business models or we can change the evaluation systems and so on. That's incredibly challenging, but you can see how that might be addressed. But the third criticism focuses on the knowledge itself, which is being disseminated using open access. And though that becomes a far more difficult problem to even think about how we can address it. So that's going to be the area I'm going to focus on, although the others will also come into play as well, of course. Now, it's worthwhile saying here that because so many of these critiques focus on the idea of epistemic justice, let's just think about that for a little while. Now, many people use the concept of epistemic or sometimes cognitive injustice in very general ways, but very often when people refer to it, they're referring to the work of Miranda Fricker, who published a book in 2007 called Epistemic Injustice. And she defines epistemic injustice as a wrong done to someone, specifically in their capacity as a knower. And she focused on two particular types of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice occurs, as she says, where prejudice causes a hearer to be given what she calls a deflated level of credibility. In other words, somebody is not listened to often because of who they are. And hermeneutical injustice is, as she puts it, a prior form of injustice, where people don't have the epistemic framework to understand what's being said. And in her book, she gives examples of these. An example of the first might be, this is a quote, example of the first might be that the police do not believe you because you're black. An example of the second might be that you suffer sexual harassment in a culture that still lacks that critical concept. And you can see how these might be applied to open access. Testimonial injustice, for example, might be seen in peer review, where somebody who has an affiliation with an institution in a low-income country, for example, their work might be rejected, or indeed in the APC model, which has been critiqued as a form of testimonial injustice because it silences the voices of those that can't afford to pay an APC. And hermeneutical injustice could occur at various different points in the research system, where researchers are not conforming to Eurocentric norms and frames in the way that they are putting forward their work. Now, the argument I want to put to you in this presentation, which is reflected in the book I published in 2024 on achieving global open access, is this: that scientific openness, and by that I mean open access and other forms of open research and open science, scientific openness is necessary but not sufficient to achieve a global open access which is both effective and equitable. Rather, what we need, I argue, is a combination of the following: scientific openness, epistemic openness, and participatory openness. By scientific openness, I mean where the content, processes, and infrastructures of research are made openly available. That's familiar to all of us. By epistemic openness, I mean a wider and more inclusive understanding of what constitutes valid and valuable knowledge. And by participatory openness, I mean a system that is open to participation from diverse communities. And what I argue is that all of these are interrelated and mutually supporting and mutually reinforcing. Now, of course, I'm making this argument from a particular perspective. I'm an academic in a research-intensive university. I was previously a practitioner. I've been, for the last 25 years, involved in advocating for open access. And of course, that and my personal identity all affect my perspective. And it's important you know where I'm coming from. And also the fact that I'm putting these ideas forward as part of a conversation. And as in order to form these arguments, I've done a great deal of listening from people from different parts of the world. And I'm also very interested to hear your responses as well as part of that ongoing conversation. So let's start then by thinking about the way in which open access has often traditionally been advocated for. And I think it's true to say that the case has often been made from an essentially positivist, or what I call an adapted positivist view of science. And that is a view that sees scientific knowledge as normative and universal. And by positivism, it's defined in the box at the bottom, referring to ontology, which is to do with our view of reality and epistemology, how we know and what knowledge we can have. And positivism has a realist ontology, an objectivist epistemology. So there's a real world out there, and which we can know and understand and measure in various different ways. And now it's important to note to begin with that if you are in favor of open access, you must at some level at least assume the universal value of the knowledge that you are circulating. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother to do it. But the question is, what is the value, and how do we know that? Now, very often this adaptive positivist view is linked to, sometimes explicitly linked to, Merton's scientific norms of universalism, communism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. Now, Merton wasn't developing these norms in the context of openness, but you can see how open access and open research advocates have associated openness with these norms. So in universalism, scientific knowledge is impersonal and objective, and therefore universally valid, and therefore it's good to make it universally available. Communism, for example, science is produced communally, and the outputs are owned by the scientific community. You can see how that resonates with the open agenda. Now, these norms were being developed during the period of the Second World War and immediately afterwards, where science was associated in the mind of many of its advocates, like Merton and Popper, with liberal democracy. And they said that science can best be practiced in a liberal democratic context. And from that came the idea of the open society as opposed to totalitarian societies. And that idea of the open society and the link between openness and liberal democracy has carried forward in the way that it is often advocated for. So, for example, the Open Society Institute very explicitly links its work with this idea of open society. And remember, the OSI was the sponsor of the Budapest Open Access Initiative meeting that led to the famous BOAI Statement of Open Access. And this is often articulated in terms of common good or public good. Now, just at this stage, it's worthwhile returning to the idea of epistemic injustice and associating these ideas with epistemic injustice. So in her later work, I've already said that Miranda Fricker talks about testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. In her later work, she categorizes this as discriminatory epistemic injustice. But she says there are other forms of epistemic injustice, notably a more obvious form in the context of liberalism, distributive epistemic injustice, which she defines as the unfair distribution of epistemic goods, such as education or information. Now, that's interesting because it might be argued that although many of the advocates of open access don't tend to use the language of epistemic justice, arguably at the center of the drive for open access throughout its history has been a desire for distributive epistemic injustice, because it talks about the fair distribution of epistemic goods, such as information. So arguably, epistemic justice has always been at the heart of open access, even though many of its advocates may not use that language. Now, that's really important to note. It's really important to note that the language and the concepts of epistemic injustice are not the monopoly of critics of open access. In fact, arguably, epistemic justice has always been at the heart of the open access movement. But nevertheless, testimonial and hermeneutical injustice are still major problems, arguably, in the open access context. So let's think about that further. And think about it in the context of positivism, because positivism, even though it has formed, if you like, the underpinning of many of the cases that are made for open access, has itself come under a great deal of criticism, particularly since the 1960s and 70s. It's critiqued in all sorts of ways. For example, conflating ontology and epistemology, in other words, assuming that scientific theory is just a straightforward description of reality, of questioning. People have questioned the fact-value distinction that is made that's a basis of positivism. You can't really distinguish between those two in reality. Now, the criticisms have taken various different forms, but all of them have in common this idea of the constructedness of knowledge, that knowledge is a construction, and that construction is by definition situated and perspectival. In other words, it's context specific and it depends on your viewpoint. Positivism can also be criticized because it can easily slide into narrow scientistic theories of knowledge, by which I mean the idea that the only valid form of knowledge is that which can be gained through scientific, narrowly conceived investigation. But we know, don't we, that some of the most important questions we ask in life can't be decided by a laboratory experiment. So just take some examples. For example, how do I live a good life? Is it right to go to war? Why did the Holocaust happen? Does my wife love me? All of these are really important questions, but they can't be answered by a laboratory experiment. So we need to recognize the valuing of different kinds of knowledge, different sorts of knowing, in order to address questions like these. So this is an argument, I would say, for valuing all disciplines, STEM and HSS, science widely conceived. And I don't have any particular trouble with thinking about all these disciplines as science in the sense of Wissenschaft, all systematic knowledge. But it's also an argument I'm making for the valuing of different kinds of knowledge and different sorts of knowing in terms of different knowledge systems, including indigenous knowledges. And this is the basis for the case I'm making for epistemic openness, which is a way of addressing hermeneutical epistemic injustice. So the first of those is the widening of our notion of the value of knowledge beyond STEM to HSS. And it's important to note that historically, at least, the case for open science, the case for open research, has often been framed in terms of STEM, taking STEM forms of investigation and knowledge as normative. So, for example, open science, with its emphasis on artifacts like data, methodological priorities like reproducibility, it doesn't tend to have much resonance with humanities and qualitative social sciences disciplines. And so we need to build a different view of openness in these contexts in a way that is appropriate for those disciplines and not just think about equivalences. It's very common for well-meaning open access advocates to say, well, in the sciences, this is about sharing data. So humanities scholars, you must have an equivalent of sharing data. So let's just work out what it is and then we can do it okay. But that's not the way to advocate to humanities scholars that don't think in those terms and operate in somewhat different ways. And so amongst a number of colleagues in the Morphs project, which is currently ongoing, are investigating ways in which we can reframe openness in a ways that is appropriate for humanities and qualitative social sciences disciplines. And we've identified 30 open practices which are particular to HSS in a recent catalogue of practices. And that is an ongoing project that I'm really excited by. So that's about expanding our notions of valid and valuable knowledge to all disciplines, which is important. But I'm also arguing for the expansion of the idea of valid and valuable knowledge to other forms of knowledge, other knowledge systems. So epistemic openness, I'm arguing, is about engagement with conventional scientific knowledge, broadly conceived to all disciplines, but also potentially indigenous knowledges as well. And this can yield fruitful results. And we're already seeing there's a growing body of literature on this, exactly this point. And we can see it in a number of particular contexts like environmental management or biodiversity and sustainable agriculture and so on, where conventional scientific knowledge is brought into dialogue with indigenous knowledges in order to yield more insight, where people, often local people from indigenous communities, bring their knowledge to the table in terms of how to manage the environment, for example. And you can see on the box on the right an example of that around fisheries management. And this is why the UNESCO Open Science recommendation calls for open dialogue with other knowledge systems as a pillar of open science, which is a really useful widening of the definition of open science away from just conventional science and infrastructure, important though those things are. Now, this is not easy. It involves a complex set of interchanges and exchanges, and it needs to be handled really sensitively and respectfully to ensure that it's genuine interaction, not extraction, and mutual benefit is achieved rather than appropriation. So I'm not claiming this is at all easy, but nevertheless, it is important to try to achieve. It does, however, lead to a problem. And the problem is where we get clashing knowledge claims, how do we resolve that clash? Now, very often we get complementary claims being made when two different knowledge systems are brought together, but sometimes we might get a clash. So, for example, if there is a pandemic, Western science says you need to use these vaccines, but other forms of indigenous knowledge medicine may have a different kind of solution. How do we resolve that where that sort of clash happens? We can't just shrug our epistemic shoulders and say, well, it's all relative. So how do we address this problem? So this argument leads to two particular questions. The first is the knowledge as oppression question. Can we bring Western science into conversation with other knowledge systems to be made to work in a way that is not oppressive? Or will conventional science always tend to dominate and marginalize other knowledges? That's the first question. The second question, the relativism and incommensurability question, is from a different direction. Does the widening of our notions of valid and valuable knowledge to include different epistemic systems based on constructionism, does that leave us with the problem of irresolvable relativism and incommensurability? Now, these questions are really important in what librarians do, because it's talking about the knowledge that we are managing and disseminating. So let's think about each of these in turn. Now, to address the knowledge as oppression question, we need to, which is based on a constructionist position, we need to just check in on constructionism, because there are different kinds of constructionism. I've talked as though it's a single kind of homogeneous whole up until now, but that is not true. And very often people make the distinction between moderate or weak constructionism on the one hand and radical or strong constructionism on the other. Radical or strong constructionism is where reality itself is regarded as a social construction, whereas moderate or weak constructionism is where there is recognized to be an objective reality separate from ourselves, but our understanding of it is mediated by or influenced by socially constructed factors. And what I want to argue is that this knowledge as oppression argument has two aspects, what I've called soft and hard. Now, the soft version of this is, I would argue, based on or is compatible with a moderate constructionist argument. This is the idea that's often summarized in the notion of bias, where theory or empirical approaches can often be biased. They can be, for example, Eurocentric or particularist in the way that they're approached. And this is a major problem, no doubt about it, across all sorts of different disciplines, from chemistry to linguistics. There is Eurocentric bias. There is no doubt about that. And that needs to be seriously addressed as part of this idea of resisting knowledge as oppression. But I would argue that open access here has a role in actually helping to do that, because it can expose bias, it can expose it to scrutiny and argument. So I would argue open access has a role in actually achieving or partly achieving the resolution of some of these very difficult problems. So that's the soft version. The hard version, though, is based on a radical constructionism. And this is the idea that scientific knowledge is inherently oppressive, that it's based on a thoroughgoing constructionism, and it leads to certain forms of social theory. And these ideas, these social theories, have been co-opted, I would suggest to you, by critiques of open access, where open access is seen as exacerbating oppression in a way that is irresolvable. And you can see some of the genealogy of ideas that this derives from on the right-hand side here. Critical theory and post-colonial theory based on strong constructionism. Now, I would argue that it's difficult to maintain, at the very least, it's difficult to maintain a hard version of this argument that scientific knowledge is necessarily a vehicle for oppression, based as it is on thoroughgoing constructionism, whilst at the same time being a supporter of open access. Because if open access is by definition an oppressive force, why would you support it? But I think it goes further than that. It leaves us, I argue, with the problem of relativism and incommensurability unresolved. So let me just say a little bit more about what that looks like. In the context of strong constructionism, the sociologist Christian Smith says that what that leads to is our knowledge about reality is therefore culturally relative, since no human has access to reality as it really is. And what that is often, how that is often manifested in this kind of analysis is that reality is seen as a vehicle of power. In fact, as Foucault says, power produces. It produces reality, he argues. Not the other way around, power produces reality. And this leads us to what Dave Elder-Vass calls a strong epistemic relativism. You can see for this quotation on the right-hand side, this argument, he says, offered by Michel Foucault, that all knowledge represents an exercise of power, leads to the conclusion there is no way to ground language and hence knowledge expressed through language objectively in the world. And this leads to a strong epistemic relativism. If our very concepts are the product of power and can only be altered by the operation of competing powers, there can be no objective basis on which to judge that any one claim about the world is better founded than any other. Now, I would argue that this undermines not just open access, but the very basis of scholarly communication, where you're debating the relative merits of different knowledge claims. So what it leads to, I would suggest to you, is that epistemic openness should have limits, and that otherwise, if we don't give it limits, we are left with irresolvable relativism and incommensurability. Now, one solution to this that I've suggested is a paradigm for knowledge and investigation, which attempts to navigate between the extremes of positivism on the one hand and radical constructionism on the other, which is something like critical realism, which has a realist ontology, a relativist epistemology, and judgmental rationality. In other words, there is a real world out there which is separate from ourselves, but our knowledge of it is subjective and contingent. But then crucially, we can discern different levels of validity through investigation and evidence. So this is compatible with a moderate constructionism, not a radical one, which acknowledges that we perceive reality through social constructions and so on, but there is a separate reality from ourselves. Now, crucially, this is about balancing all knowledge claims, but it doesn't relativize away the value of science. That's what I'm arguing. And it can enable the valuing of different kinds of knowledge, but all of those knowledges contribute to an ongoing conversation about the best explanations. Now, this position, I would argue, is welcoming of open access because it enables, open access enables that conversation to happen. It enables different perspectives and contributions to be brought to the table. And it also is compatible with highly generative social theory that can help us understand and frame open access. So commons theory, for example, which I've used a lot in my own research, is essentially a realist theory. And it's important to recognize that when it's being used. And we can see how these conversations can happen in the context of open access. So during the COVID pandemic, Haverman et al. Talked about how indigenous knowledges were brought into conversation with Western science in African context, often mediated in a respectful way through African scientists themselves. But all explanations were subjected to scrutiny and testing. And I would argue this is part of what scholarly communication enabled by open access is all about, enabling that conversation to happen. But radical constructionism and its relativism do not necessitate these conversations. It's important, as Groff says on the bottom box on the right-hand side, if all beliefs about the world are equally valid, then no claims can be challenged on cognitive or epistemic grounds. At best, relativism can therefore be expected to discourage critical analysis and exchange. For what is the point of attempts to persuade through argumentation if all claims about the world are by definition equally valid? At worst, it implies that critical exchange ought to be abandoned in favor of the use of force and/or non-rational charismatic appeals. And I would argue that unfortunately we're seeing that in much of our politics and discourse today, when the idea of objective knowledge is jettisoned. However difficult it is for us to construct and articulate that objective reality. Now, I don't have much time here, so I'm going to finish up very quickly. I will just have one slide on participatory openness, not because it's not important, but because it hasn't been the fundamental focus for this talk. And because many of the ideas about participatory openness that I'm arguing for in my book are more familiar. This is the widest range of contributors engaging with research across demographic, geographic, and other perspectives. And you can see on the right-hand side here how different forms of current unfairness and injustice can be addressed in this mode of participatory openness. So the APC business model, for example, the response to that is to invest in other forms of open access. And I'm really pleased that the Diamond Open Access approach and other forms of alternative publishing are now receiving much more attention. And the point is that just as hermeneutical injustice is addressed through epistemic openness or partially addressed through epistemic openness, here testimonial epistemic injustice is being addressed through participatory openness. And we need that in scholarly communication. And so there's a need, I'm arguing, to recast openness, learning potentially from other modes of participation. So, for example, I would argue in this respect, the Global North has a great deal to learn from the Global South in terms of publishing models that are low cost and yet do not create these same testimonial injustices. So we need to recast openness, but also reach beyond open science and open research to addressing other problems like reward and incentive structures that drive behaviors towards traditional scholarly communication. And so it's really important, I would argue, that open access advocates, including librarians, don't just confine themselves to the library, but actually are involved in this bigger conversation about what constitutes valid knowledge, how we know, and how we can adjust academic systems to create participatory openness. Now, none of this is easy. It's really challenging. So I'm not claiming this is an easy thing to do, quite the opposite. Connell's view of this around social sciences, I would argue, applies to all disciplines. This is what she says: to change the way metropolitan social science operates in the world requires a retooling that will be arduous and perhaps also expensive. professional self-images, personal stocks of knowledge, affiliations, citation practices, publication practices, both of individuals and publishing houses, grant getting and practical applications of social science are all at stake, as is teaching. So this is fundamental, it is structural, and it leads to the necessity of change, both at individual and personal level, as well as structural levels as well. But I would argue that in order for this to be the case, however challenging this is, open access has a role to play in addressing the problems, in creating or contributing to the creation of systemic change, if open access is implemented in a way that recognizes the current problems and a way that signals real change. And if we promote a system where there is a coexistence of scientific openness along with epistemic openness and participatory openness. Thanks very much for listening.